I have nowhere else to go." Charlotte Reyes said those words to no one. To the empty platform, to the cold Montana wind, to the letter she'd read so many times, the paper had softened at the folds. The man who promised her a home, a ranch, an east-facing kitchen window, had a wife already. Had always had a wife. And she was standing at the end of the earth with a trunk 40 cents and nothing behind her worth going back to. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and follow Charlotte's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The station master wouldn't look her in the eye when he said it. That was the first thing Charlotte noticed. He was a round-faced man with a gray mustache and ink stains on his fingers, and he had clearly delivered bad news before, but not like this. Not to a young woman holding a carpet bag in one hand and a folded letter in the other, still dressed in her good traveling clothes, because she'd wanted to make a proper first impression. "Miss," he said, his voice dropping the way men's voices dropped when they were trying not to be responsible for something. "The party you're looking for, Whitcomb, he doesn't come around here anymore. Hasn't for some months." Charlotte felt something shift in her chest. Not break, not yet. Just shift. "He sent me a letter," she said. 3 weeks ago, he gave this station as the meeting point. The station master finally looked at her. And what she saw in his face was worse than pity. It was recognition. "You're not the first one," he said quietly. She heard the words. Her mind repeated them. "You're not the first one." She set her carpet bag down on the platform very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone to see. "I beg your pardon." He leaned against the counter and rubbed the back of his neck. "There was a woman last spring, came from Ohio, and one before that from Tennessee, I think. Daniel Whitcomb has been writing letters to women out east for the better part of 2 years. He paused. "He has a wife, miss. Has had one the whole time. Family, too, I hear, down in Billings." The platform tilted, or felt like it did. Charlotte pressed her fingers flat against the wooden counter to steady herself, and she breathed once slow and deliberate, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when the world tried to knock her down. "He was never going to come," she said. Not a question. She was just hearing herself say it out loud to make it real. "No, miss. I don't believe he was." She looked down at the letter in her hand. Daniel Whitcomb's handwriting, which she had once called lovely, slanted neatly across the page. He had written about the Montana winters, how brutal they were, but how the spring made up for everything. He had written about the smell of hay in the morning and the sound of the creek that ran behind the property. He had written, and she had read this line so many times she could say it without looking. "I find myself counting the days until I am no longer alone." She folded the letter. She folded it along its existing creases very precisely, and she placed it in the pocket of her coat. "Is there a hotel in this town?" she asked. "Boarding house," the station master said. "Mrs. Gable's on Sutter Street. It's about a quarter mile." "And is there work? Honest work somewhere in this town?" He blinked at her. "I couldn't say, miss. It's not a large town." "No," Charlotte said. "I imagine not." She picked up her carpet bag. She looked at her trunk, which was large and heavy and contained everything she owned. Her spare dresses, her mother's quilt, the 2 books she'd carried west because she couldn't bear to leave them. She could not carry the trunk. She could barely carry herself. "I'll leave that here tonight if you don't mind," she said, nodding toward the trunk. "I'll collect it in the morning." "Of course," he said, and she heard real sorrow in his voice, which she could not afford to acknowledge, because if she let herself feel the kindness of a stranger right now, she was going to fall apart entirely on this platform, and she had already decided she was not going to do that. She walked out into the evening air. Millbrook, Montana Territory was not a large town, but it was a real one. It had a general store and a church and a saloon and a blacksmith and several dozen houses arranged along unpaved streets that turned to mud when it rained. It had a quality that Charlotte recognized from the factory town she'd grown up in. Not prosperity exactly, but persistence. This was a place where people had decided to stay. She had 40 cents in her pocket. She had no return ticket. She'd spent her savings on the journey west on the new dress she'd bought specifically for meeting Daniel Whitcomb, on the hope that the letters were real and the man was real, and the east-facing kitchen window was real. She walked with her head up. She had learned that at the mill, the women who walked with their heads down got stepped on, literally and otherwise. You kept your chin level. You kept your eyes forward. You let the world think you were not afraid, even when your heart was slamming against your ribs like a bird against glass. She had almost reached what she guessed was Sutter Street when she heard the horse. Not the sound of it passing, the sound of it stopping. She turned. A man had pulled up alongside her on a dark bay horse. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she thought, with weathered skin and quiet eyes, and the kind of stillness that some men wore like a second skin. Not coldness exactly, but the absence of unnecessary movement. He wore a coat that had seen serious weather. His hat was plain. He looked at her the way you'd look at something you weren't sure how to account for, with no judgment in it, just attention. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she replied. He looked at the carpet bag in her hand. He looked at the direction she'd come from, which was the train station. "You just arrive?" he asked. "I did." "Looking for somewhere in particular?" "Mrs. Gable's boarding house." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've got your back to it. Other direction." She turned and looked. Sure enough, half a block behind her, there was a painted sign she'd walked right past. She took a breath. "Thank you." She turned to go. "You've got a trunk at the station?" he asked. She stopped, turned back. "How did you know that?" "Because you've got a traveling bag," he said. "But you're not carrying near enough for a woman who came from a distance. Women who come from a distance have trunks." She looked at him for a moment. There was something very deliberate about the way he spoke, not slow exactly, but careful. Like he chose each word before he used it. "I left it at the station," she said. "I'll retrieve it in the morning." "I've got a wagon," he said. "I can get it now if you want. Save you the trip." Charlotte Reyes had been raised by a cautious woman in a mill town, where you did not accept help from strangers without asking yourself what the help was going to cost you. She looked at this man on his dark horse, and she measured him. His face, his posture, the way he'd stopped in the first place. He wasn't looking at her the way the men at the mill had sometimes looked at young women alone. He was looking at her the way you looked at a problem that needed solving. "That's very kind," she said. "But I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "Nathaniel Cross. I have a ranch about 4 miles north of here. I come into town on Thursdays for supplies." "Charlotte Reyes," she said. "I've just arrived from Massachusetts." "Long way," he said. "Yes." "You got someone here." The question was direct enough that it caught her off guard, and for one terrible second she felt the answer pressing up against the back of her teeth. "No, there is no one. There was supposed to be someone, and there is no one, and I am here in the middle of Montana with 40 cents and a letter from a man who has a wife," but she swallowed it back down. "Not anymore," she said. Something crossed his face. Not curiosity, not sympathy, just a kind of quiet understanding, as if he knew there was a story there and had decided it wasn't his to ask for. "I'll get your trunk," he said. "You get yourself settled at Mrs. Gable's. I'll bring it round." "Mr. Cross." "It's no trouble," he said simply. And there was something in the plainness of it. No performance, no expectation, just a statement of fact that undid a small specific piece of her composure. She nodded. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved. Mrs. Gable was exactly the kind of woman a town like Millbrook needed, sharp-eyed, warm-handed, and impossible to fool. She was somewhere north of 60, with silver hair pinned severely back and an apron she apparently never took off. And when Charlotte knocked on the door of the boarding house, she opened it immediately, as if she'd been watching from the window, which she probably had. She looked Charlotte up and down in about 2 seconds. "Train came in an hour ago," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You're alone?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Gable opened the door wider. "Come in, then. You look like you could use something hot to drink." The boarding house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking. Charlotte followed the woman into a small sitting room and sat down in the chair she was gestured toward, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at nothing in particular, because if she looked at the warmth, and the lamp glow, and the small picture of flowers someone had hung on the wall, she was going to feel the full weight of the day, and she wasn't ready for that yet. "I'll need a room," Charlotte said. "I have 40 cents tonight. I can work for the rest." Mrs. Gable set a cup of something down in front of her tea, or close enough. "Can you?" "I worked in a mill for 4 years," Charlotte said. "Before that I kept my mother's house after she got too sick to manage it. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep accounts. I sew well. I'm not afraid of work." "No," Mrs. Gable said, studying her. "I don't imagine you are." She sat down across from her. "You were coming to meet someone." It wasn't a question. Charlotte looked at her. "Word travels," Mrs. Gable said, not unkindly. "The station master's wife is my cousin." Charlotte breathed. "Daniel Whitcomb." "I know the name," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was flat and careful, in the way that meant she had opinions she was choosing to keep back. "Then you know what he is." "I know what kind of man writes to women who are too far away to verify his claims," Mrs. Gable said. "Yes." Charlotte wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the heat soak into her palms. "I need work," she said. "Honest work. I don't need charity. I don't need pity. I need someone to pay me fairly for what I can do, so that I can eat and put a roof over my head until I work out what comes next." Mrs. Gable looked at her for a long moment. "You're Catholic." Charlotte blinked. "Yes." "Good. Reverend Miller won't be able to place you. He places the Methodists." She stood up. "You can have the room at the back for $2 a week, meals included. In exchange, you'll help with the breakfast service and the laundry on Mondays. That covers the room. Anything beyond that we negotiate." Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest. Just slightly. Just enough. "That's fair," she said. "It is," Mrs. Gable agreed. "Nathaniel Cross is bringing your trunk." Charlotte looked up. "You know him too?" "Everyone knows Nathaniel Cross," Mrs. Gable said. "He's been coming to town on Thursday since his wife passed. 4 years now, maybe 5. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't cause trouble. He pays his accounts on time." She paused. "He's a decent man." "He seemed so," Charlotte said carefully. "They don't always seem it and turn out to be," Mrs. Gable said. "With him it goes the other direction. He's better than he seems." She moved toward the hallway. "I'll show you your room. You can eat what's left from supper if you're hungry." Charlotte was hungry. She was exhausted. She was in a town she'd never heard of 6 months ago, in a state she'd never been to, and she had nowhere to be tomorrow, and no one expecting her, and nothing tying her to any particular place on the earth. She picked up her cup and followed Mrs. Gable down the hall. Nathaniel brought the trunk around just before 9 o'clock. Charlotte heard the wagon, heard the knock, heard Mrs. Gable's voice, and then his low brief, a handful of words, and then the sound of the trunk being carried inside. She stayed in her room. Through the thin wall, she heard Mrs. Gable say something she couldn't quite make out, and then Nathaniel's voice quiet. "She doing all right? And Mrs. Gable?" "She's doing what she can." A pause. "Good night, then," Nathaniel said, and then the wagon moving away. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, in the back room of Mrs. Gable's boarding house with her hands in her lap, and the lamp turned low and the sound of Montana wind pressing against the window, and she allowed herself finally to feel the shape of the day. She had come 2,000 miles for a man who didn't exist. Not the way he'd presented himself anyway. The handwriting had been real. The stamps had been real. The hope she'd carried all the way from Lowell, Massachusetts carefully like something fragile that had been as real as anything she'd ever felt. And it was based on nothing. She thought about the women who had come before her. The one from Ohio last spring. The one from Tennessee. She thought about what it had cost each of them to make that journey, not just the money, but the decision. The moment when each of them had thought, yes, this is possible. Yes, this is worth the risk. Yes, I believe this man is who he says he is. She thought about the particular cruelty of that not violence, not shouting, but just the slow, deliberate construction of a hope for someone else to walk into. She would not cry. She had decided that before she left the platform. But she sat with it. She let herself sit with the fullness of it, the weight, the particular ache of having wanted something sincerely, and having been made a fool of for that sincerity. Then she stood up. She opened her trunk, and she took out her mother's quilt, and she spread it over the bed. She took out her Bible, which her mother had given her, and she set it on the nightstand. She took out the 2 books she'd brought, a volume of American poetry and a practical guide to household management that she'd bought at a second-hand stall, and she set those beside it. She arranged her dresses in the small wardrobe. She unpacked her mother's quilt and her Bible and her 2 books, and she made that bare, strange room into something that was hers. Then she got into bed. In the morning, the town was different in daylight. Charlotte rose early habit from the mill, where the whistle didn't care whether you'd slept, and she was in the kitchen before Mrs. Gable, which earned her the first genuine look of approval she'd received since arriving. "Eggs," Mrs. Gable said, not quite a question. "I can do eggs," Charlotte said. There were 4 boarders, besides herself. 2 railroad surveyors passing through an older man named Hicks, who seemed to have been at the boarding house long enough to become part of the furniture, and a young schoolteacher named Miss Darby, who had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and whose cheerful practicality Charlotte found immediately steadying. Miss Darby sat next to Charlotte at breakfast and said without preamble, "You're the one who was supposed to meet Whitcomb." "News travels fast," Charlotte said. "In Millbrook it travels faster than that," Miss Darby said. "Don't let it bother you. Half the women in this territory have a story about a man who turned out to be something other than advertised." She buttered her toast with the efficiency of someone who had come to terms with reality. "What are you going to do?" "Work," Charlotte said. "Figure out the rest." "Good answer." Miss Darby looked at her sideways. "What kind of work?" "Whatever kind is available." "Can you keep accounts?" Charlotte looked at her. "I can." "There's a ranch north of town," Miss Darby said. "The Cross Ranch. He's been asking around for someone to sort out his record-keeping for months. He did his own books until about a year ago, and apparently they've gotten into a state." Charlotte said nothing. "You know him?" Miss Darby asked. "We've met," Charlotte said. "He's not a bad sort," Miss Darby said. "Quiet. Keeps to himself. But he's fair." She paused. "It's good wages if he still needs someone, and it would get you something to do while you figure out what comes next." Charlotte ate her eggs. She thought about a man on a dark horse who had offered to carry her trunk without asking her for anything in exchange. She thought about Mrs. Gable's voice through the wall. "She's doing what she can," and his "good night then. I'll think about it," she said. She didn't have to think about it long. At 10:30 that morning, there was a knock at the front door of the boarding house, and Mrs. Gable came to find Charlotte in the small sitting room, where she was mending one of Mrs. Gable's tablecloths. Another thing she'd offered to do in exchange for the room. "Nathaniel Cross is here," Mrs. Gable said. Her expression was carefully neutral. Charlotte set down the tablecloth. "Is he? He'd like a word with you if you're willing." She paused. "You don't have to." "I know," Charlotte said. She smoothed her skirt. She stood up. "I'll see him." He was waiting in the front hallway, hat in his hands, an instinct of manners she thought the kind you did without thinking. He looked the same as the night before. Same quiet face. Same careful stillness. "Miss Reyes," he said. "Mr. Cross." He didn't beat around it. "I heard from Miss Darby that you might be looking for work. I need someone to organize my records. My accounts going back 2 years are a wreck, and I've got no patience for figures." He paused. "It's honest work, fair wages. You'd come out to the ranch a few days a week." Charlotte looked at him. "Why me?" He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because you asked the station master about honest work before you asked about anything else," he said. "He told his wife. His wife told Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable told well." He paused. News travels. Something that might have been amusement moved through her briefly. What are the wages? She asked. He told her. They were as Miss Darby had promised good. I'd need to review the state of the accounts first, she said, before I agree to a timeline or a rate. If they're in a serious state, it may take more time than you're expecting. He nodded. That's fair. And I'd need transport to and from the ranch. I don't have a horse. I can arrange that. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? The question hung in the air between them. He looked at her steadily. Because you need work, he said. And I need someone who can do it. He paused. That's all. Charlotte Reyes had spent 4 years in a mill town learning to measure men by what they wanted from you. She had learned to read the gap between what a man said and what he meant. The small tells the way the eyes moved, the quality of the smile, the things they said too quickly or too slowly. Nathaniel Cross said what he meant. She was almost certain of it. I'll come tomorrow, she said, to look at the accounts. He nodded. I'll send the wagon at 8. He put his hat back on. He said good day. He left. Mrs. Gable appeared in the hallway doorway as if she'd materialized from the wallpaper. Well, she said. It's work, Charlotte said. Of course it is. Mrs. Gable agreed in the tone of someone who was thinking several things at once and choosing to say only the smallest one. The wagon came at 8. It was driven by a weathered ranch hand named Clem, who had approximately 4 teeth and an absolute refusal to make small talk, which Charlotte respected entirely. She sat on the bench beside him, with her hands folded, and watched the territory open up around her as they drove north. Montana in late October was a world in its own right. The land rolled and stretched in ways she had no reference for, coming from the close crowded geography of Massachusetts. The sky was enormous. The light came sideways in the mornings, cold and golden, touching everything at an angle. She did not let herself think it was beautiful. Not yet. Beauty was for people who had the luxury of standing still, and she was not there yet. The Cross Ranch was a working property, not grand, not pretentious, but solid. The house was 2-storied, built of timber and stone, with a covered porch and a yard that had clearly once been kept up, and now showed the edges of long neglect. The barns were in better shape than the yard. That told her something. Nathaniel Cross was waiting on the porch when the wagon pulled up. He led her inside without ceremony. The interior of the house stopped her not from mess, not from disorder, but from the particular quality of its stillness. It was clean. Surfaces were clear. Everything was in its place. But it had the feeling of a house where no one lived in the rooms so much as passed through them. Furniture that wasn't sat on. Curtains that were closed. He led her to a small room off the kitchen that served as an office, a desk buried under ledgers and loose papers and receipts folded and refolded until they were soft as cloth. There, he said. Charlotte looked at it. She pulled out the chair and sat down and began methodically to look through what was there. He left her to it. An hour later, she had a general picture, and she came to find him in the kitchen, where he was drinking coffee and looking out the window. Your accounts aren't as bad as they look, she said. Someone kept reasonable notes. I assume that was you. Until 2 years ago, he said. Yes. What happened 2 years ago? A silence. I stopped, he said. She did not push it. All right, the past 2 years are disordered, but the information is mostly there. It's just been filed without a system. If you give me 3 weeks, maybe 4, I can reconstruct everything accurately and set up a system that will make future bookkeeping manageable. He looked at her. Even for someone with no patience for figures, she added. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in that direction. 3 weeks, he said. Possibly 4. Start Monday, he said. She started Monday. It was on her 3rd day at the ranch that she found the photograph. It was tucked between the pages of one of the older ledgers, a small portrait, the kind photographers made in town studios. A woman and a child. The woman was young and had a direct, open face. The child was a boy, perhaps 3 years old, with wide, curious eyes. They were posed formally, but the woman had her hand on the boy's shoulder in a way that was entirely natural, entirely unposed, entirely real. Charlotte looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she placed it face down on the desk so it wouldn't be damaged, and she went back to the ledger. At noon, Nathaniel brought her coffee without being asked, as he had on Monday and Tuesday. He set it on the corner of the desk. He saw the photograph. His face changed. She had been watching his face for 3 days, with the same careful attention she gave to the account books, looking for patterns, looking for truth under the surface, and she had not seen it change until now. It was not dramatic. It was just a kind of deepening, like something moving below still water. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "I was careful with it." "It's fine," he said. His voice was the same, but his eyes stayed on the photograph for one long moment before he picked up his coffee cup and went back to the door. "Your wife," Charlotte said. She didn't know why she asked. She didn't make a habit of asking things that weren't her business. He stopped. "And my son," he said. He walked out. She looked at the office doorway where he'd been standing. She thought about the house clean but unoccupied, the yard that used to be kept up, the accounts that stopped 2 years ago. She thought about what it meant to have a life and lose it so completely that you stopped keeping accounts, because what was the point of accounting for anything when the things that mattered couldn't be counted? She picked up her pen. She went back to work, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. Not with pity. She was careful about that because pity wasn't what she felt, and she didn't believe he would want it, but with a kind of recognition. The particular shape of a person who has lost something irreplaceable and taught themselves to keep moving anyway. She knew something about that shape. She had seen it in the mirror for the past 4 years, since her mother died, since the mill, and the loneliness, and the letter from Daniel Whitcomb that had felt like a door opening in a wall she'd stopped believing had doors. Nathaniel Cross had built his walls differently, thicker maybe, higher. But she knew the architecture. She filed the ledger carefully. She drank her coffee. She kept working. She had been at the ranch 11 days when Nathaniel Cross did something that surprised her. He asked her opinion. Not about the accounts. He never interfered with the accounts, had accepted her system with a wordless nod and left her entirely to it. This was different. She was at the desk when he appeared in the doorway, and instead of setting down her coffee and leaving, he stayed. "The east pasture fence," he said. "Clem thinks we should wait until spring to repair it. I think it needs doing before the first hard freeze." Charlotte looked up from the ledger. "Why are you asking me?" "Because you've been looking at my costs for 11 days, he said. "You know what I can spend." She set down her pen. "What does the fence repair cost?" he told her. She thought about it. "If you lose cattle because the fence failed in a storm, what does that cost?" He was quiet. "Do the fence?" she said. She picked up her pen. He said right, and left. Clem came to find her that afternoon, while she was in the yard, stretching her back between hours at the desk. He was chewing something unidentifiable, and squinting at her the way he squinted at weather he didn't trust. "He listened to you," Clem said. "He asked a practical question, and I gave a practical answer," Charlotte said. "He don't ask many people questions," Clem said, and walked away. She stood in the yard and thought about that. A man who didn't ask questions had asked her one. She filed that away alongside the coffee that appeared every morning without discussion, alongside the fact that he had quietly begun eating lunch at the kitchen table on the days she was there, instead of out in the barn, as she suspected he'd done before. Not reaching toward her, not performing kindness, just adjusting, making small accommodations so naturally that she almost didn't notice them happening. Almost. It was Mrs. Gable who first said it plainly. Charlotte had been in Millbrook 3 weeks, and on Thursday evenings she had fallen into the habit of sitting with Mrs. Gable in the front room after the supper dishes were done, drinking whatever Mrs. Gable was drinking, usually something from a bottle she kept on the high shelf, and never named, and talking or not talking, with the comfortable ease of 2 women who had each long since stopped requiring conversation to fill a silence. He's going to offer you something more permanent, Mrs. Gable said without looking up from her mending. Charlotte didn't pretend to misunderstand. The account work is temporary. He knows that. I'm not talking about the account work. Charlotte looked at her. Mrs. Gable bit off her thread. He watched his wife die in that house, she said matter-of-factly. And then his boy 2 weeks after. Fever. It moved fast. She set down her mending and picked up her glass. He didn't leave the ranch for 6 months after. People brought food out to Clem to leave on the porch. He wouldn't see anyone. Charlotte felt something shift in the room. He came back eventually, Mrs. Gable continued. Comes to town every Thursday, pays his accounts, says his words, but that house has been empty in the way that matters. She looked at Charlotte steadily. And then you arrived. I arrived because a man lied to me, Charlotte said. Yes, Mrs. Gable said, and you're still here because you're stronger than what was done to you. She picked up her mending again. I'm not saying anything is going to happen or ought to happen. I'm saying, keep your eyes open. Charlotte said nothing. She kept her eyes open. Mom, the twist came on a Tuesday, and it came from the last direction she expected. She had finished early with the accounts. A small discrepancy in the spring cattle figures had resolved itself neatly, and she was feeling the particular satisfaction of work completed cleanly, and she was waiting for Clem and the wagon when she heard voices in the yard. Not Clem. A different voice. Educated with a slick surface to it, the kind of voice that had been trained to sound trustworthy. She heard Nathaniel say flatly, I told you last month the answer is no. Nathaniel. The other voice was patient practiced. The railroad is coming through whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you benefit or get left behind. Get off my property, Alderman. You're being unreasonable. The offer is fair. The offer is half what the land is worth, and you know it. Nathaniel's voice had an edge to it now. I know what you did to the Hendersons. I know what you did to the widow Marsh. You're not doing it to me. A pause. When the educated voice came back, it was still smooth, but something had slid underneath it. You're going to want to reconsider. It would be a shame if the county assessor found reason to question your land title. Silence. Then Nathaniel very quietly. Say that again. I'm just noting that these things can get complicated, the voice said. Records get lost. Boundaries get disputed. A man with no family and no one to advocate for him can find himself in a difficult position. Another pause. Think it over. I'll come back in 2 weeks. Charlotte stood very still inside the doorway. She heard footsteps, the educated voice walking away. Then a horse. Then nothing. She waited 30 seconds, then she walked out. Nathaniel was standing in the yard with his back to her, one hand at his side very still. Who was that? She asked. He turned. He looked at her for a moment with a measuring expression as if deciding how much to say. Gerald Alderman, he said. He represents a land acquisition company. They've been buying up ranches in this valley for the past year. Some of those transactions were not what I'd call entirely voluntary. He threatened your land title, Charlotte said. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. You heard that. I was inside. I wasn't trying to listen. He turned away again, looked at the horizon. He's done it before to others. Had his people file forged surveys at the county office. By the time the real owner figures out what's happened, the title's already transferred. Charlotte's mind moved quickly through what she knew, 4 years of mill accounts of watching men in suits find legal mechanisms to take what wasn't theirs, of learning to read the fine print because no one else was going to read it for you. Do you have your original title documents? She asked. Of course. Filed at the county seat. Filed when I homesteaded, 12 years ago. Then it's harder to dispute than he's suggesting, she said. Not impossible, but harder. They'd need to manufacture a competing claim, which means forged documents, which means risk. She paused. Do you have a lawyer? He gave her a look that said the question was slightly absurd. This is Montana territory. There are lawyers in territorial courts. There are, he said. He looked at her. You know something about this. I know something about men who use legal language as a weapon, she said. I watched it happen in the mills for 4 years. The language sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just intimidation dressed up in paper. She held his gaze. Don't wait for him to come back. Get your documents in order. Write to the Territorial Land Office and request a certified copy of your original filing. That gives you something on record that isn't at the county level, where aldermen might have friends. Nathaniel stared at her. You know how to do that, he said. I know how to write a letter, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, all right. She went back inside. She sat down at the desk. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. She thought about Daniel Whitcomb, about men who constructed elaborate frauds using paper and ink, and the assumption that the person being defrauded wasn't paying close enough attention. She was paying attention. She wrote the letter that afternoon and showed it to Nathaniel before she left. He read it twice, slowly. Then he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than that, as if he was recalibrating something. You wrote this like you've done it before, he said. I've had to advocate for myself before, she said. In writing. It's not so different. Will it work? It makes a record, she said. That's what matters. It tells the territorial office that you're watching, and it tells Alderman when he finds out, and he will find out that you're not undefended. She paused. He was counting on you being alone. Nathaniel said nothing. People who want to take what's yours always count on you being alone, she said. It's the first thing they calculate. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, Thank you, Charlotte. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She picked up her coat. I'll be back Thursday, she said. And she walked out to where Clem was waiting with the wagon. She didn't let herself think about how her name had sounded in his mouth until she was halfway back to town. And when she did think about it, she looked at the open sky and breathed slowly and told herself it was just a name. It was just a man being polite. But she held it anyway carefully, like something she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to hold. The letter came the following week. Not from the Territorial Land Office. Charlotte had written that letter. This was a different letter, and it was addressed to her. She knew the handwriting. She stared at it for a full minute before she opened it. It had been forwarded from her old address in Lowell to the boarding house, which meant Daniel Whitcomb had sent it before she left Massachusetts, or someone who knew where she was going had redirected it. Either way, it had found her, and it lay in her hand like a small, ugly thing. She opened it in her room alone with the door closed. Dear Charlotte, it began. I imagine by now you have arrived and found me absent. I am sorry for the confusion. Circumstances have changed, and my situation is more complicated than I conveyed in my letters. I hope you will understand that I meant you no harm and acted in the hope that things might resolve themselves. I trust you are resourceful enough to manage. That was all. No apology that meant anything. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. I hope you will understand. As if his comfort, his hope that she would smooth it over and not make it complicated, was something she owed him. I trust you are resourceful enough to manage. She folded the letter. She sat with it in her lap for a moment. Then she went downstairs and found Mrs. Gable and said, Do you have something I can burn this in? Mrs. Gable looked at the letter. She looked at Charlotte's face. She went to the kitchen without a word and came back with a small tin basin, and Charlotte burned the letter in it, right there in the hallway, and watched the paper curl and blacken and become nothing. Feel better? Mrs. Gable asked. No, Charlotte said honestly. But I will. She went back to her room and sat on the bed, and let herself feel it, all of it, the full depth of it. The genuine humiliation of having trusted someone so thoroughly undeserving of trust. She felt it without flinching. And then she said out loud to nobody, I am resourceful enough to manage, and meant it. The following Thursday at the ranch, she found something had changed. Not in the house in Nathaniel. He was waiting when Clem brought her in, which was not unusual, but he was standing differently. Less guarded. She had learned in these weeks to read the architecture of how he held himself, The particular set of his shoulders when something was on his mind, the way his hands stilled when he was working something through. He was working something through. She went to the office. She worked for an hour. He appeared in the doorway. Alderman was back, he said. She set down her pen. When? Yesterday. He brought someone with him, a man who claimed to be a surveyor. His jaw was tight. They walked my north boundary line like they had a right to it. Did you stop them? I told them to get off my land. He came into the room and sat down, something he'd never done before, just sat down in the chair across from her desk as if they were two people having a conversation, which was, she realized, exactly what they were. They left, but Alderman said something before he went. She waited. He said the title on my north parcel was filed incorrectly in 1871. He said there was a survey error and the acreage in the filing doesn't match the actual land. Charlotte felt her mind go sharp. Is there a survey error? I don't know, Nathaniel said. My filing was done by the county clerk at the time. I paid the standard fees. I homesteaded the land legally. He paused. But I don't have a surveyor's map that I filed myself. I relied on the county record. Then that's what they're targeting, Charlotte said. The county record. If Alderman has someone at the county office, he does, Nathaniel said flatly. Whitfield, the deputy assessor. Everyone knows it, no one can prove it. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She thought carefully. What we filed with the Territorial Land Office last week. Your original homestead claim dates from 1871. That predates any dispute Alderman can manufacture. If he tries to challenge the north parcel, the territorial filing becomes your anchor. The county can be corrupted. The territorial record is harder. Harder, Nathaniel said. Not impossible. No, she said. Not impossible, which means we need a surveyor of our own. An independent one not connected to the county. He looked at her. Do you know one? She asked. I might. There's a man in Helena. He paused. It costs money. She pulled the account ledger across the desk and opened it. She had been working on his accounts long enough to know exactly what he could spend and where. You have a margin, she said. Not a large one, but enough for a legitimate survey. She turned the ledger so he could see the figures. He leaned forward and looked. He was close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes clearly. Not old, just weathered, put there by years of weather and grief and Montana winters. He looked at the figures, then he looked at her. You've been managing this like it was your own, he said quietly. Charlotte felt something snag in her chest. It's my job, she said carefully. It's more than the job, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact, said plainly the way he said most things. She didn't answer. She closed the ledger. Write to the man in Helena, she said. Tell him what Alderman told you about the survey error. Ask for an independent assessment of the north parcel boundary. Don't mention Alderman by name in the letter, just describe the dispute. And ask for a written report certified that you can file. He nodded slowly. You'll help me draft it. I'll draft it now if you want. He said, I'll get you more coffee. He got up and went to the kitchen. She pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her. She thought for a moment about where she had been 6 weeks ago, a platform in the cold 40 cents, and a folded letter, and nothing behind her worth going back to. She thought about Nathaniel Cross, who had offered to carry her trunk without asking her for anything. She thought about the photograph in the ledger, the woman and the boy with wide, curious eyes. She picked up her pen. Nathaniel came back with the coffee. He set it at the corner of the desk the way he always did. He sat down across from her again. You don't have to keep doing this, he said. It's beyond what I hired you for. You hired me to manage your accounts, she said without looking up from the paper. Your land is your primary asset. If someone takes your land, your accounts don't matter. A silence. Charlotte, he said. She looked up. Why are you helping me? He asked. And it wasn't a skeptical question. It wasn't the suspicious squint of a man who thought kindness was a transaction waiting to reveal its price. It was a genuine question. The kind a person asked when they had been alone long enough to forget that people sometimes just helped each other. She thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer had something to do with a letter she'd burned in a tin basin and a woman in a photograph who had her hand on her boy's shoulder in a way that was entirely natural and entirely real, and a man who had said, "My empty house is yours," without saying it at all, who had said it in coffee and questions about fences, and the first time he'd sat down across from her like they were just two people. "Because someone should," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked down at the desk. "All right," he said softly. "All right." She wrote the letter. She was back in town by late afternoon. Miss Darby intercepted her on the porch of the boarding house with the expression of someone carrying information they couldn't quite wait to deliver. "Alderman was in town today," Miss Darby said. "He was at the general store asking about you." Charlotte stopped. "About me? About who you were and where you came from and what you were doing out at the Cross Ranch?" Miss Darby's voice was carefully even, but her eyes were alert. "Henderson's wife was in the store. She said he was fishing, trying to figure out if you were family or a lawyer's associate or—" "What did Mrs. Henderson say?" "She said she didn't know you well enough to say." Miss Darby paused. "But she came to tell me, because she doesn't like aldermen, because of what happened to their property last year." Charlotte stood very still. "He's noticed me," she said. It wasn't quite alarm. It was more like the feeling you got when you were working a math problem and suddenly realized the numbers on the other side were working against you just as hard. "He's noticed that Nathaniel Cross suddenly has someone in his corner," Miss Darby said. "And yes, I think that worries him." Charlotte thought about what Nathaniel had said on the platform that first night. Women who come from a distance have trunks. He had calculated her situation from a handful of observable facts. Alderman was doing the same thing now and arriving at the same correct conclusion. She was not alone, and she was in Alderman's way. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She went inside. At dinner that night she was quieter than usual, and Mrs. Gable noticed, but didn't push. And after the dishes were done and the boarders had retreated to their rooms, Charlotte sat in the front room with the lamp turned low and thought. She had come to Montana for a lie. She had stayed because she had no choice. She had taken a job because she needed one. And somewhere in the space of 6 weeks, without intending to, and without quite noticing, she had gotten herself tangled up in the life of a man she barely knew. Defending a piece of land, she had no stake in making an enemy of a man with resources and a deputy assessor in his pocket. She could leave. The thought came clearly the way honest thoughts did when you let yourself get still enough to hear them. She could find passage east or to one of the larger towns, start over somewhere without any of this complexity. She sat with that thought. She sat with it the way she'd sat with the shape of the day the night she arrived fully without flinching. And then she set it down. She was not going to leave. Not because she had nowhere to go. She'd had nowhere to go before, and it hadn't stopped her. She wasn't going to leave because she was in the middle of something that mattered. She wasn't going to leave because Nathaniel Cross had walked into town on a dark horse and offered to carry her trunk, and hadn't asked her for a single thing in return. She wasn't going to leave because someone should help him, and she was the someone who was there. She went upstairs and went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. The surveyor's letter came back from Helena in 9 days. Charlotte had expected 2 weeks, maybe 3. 9 days meant the man was either very good or very alarmed by what Nathaniel had described, and when she read the letter over Nathaniel's shoulder at the kitchen table that Thursday morning, she understood it was the second one. The surveyor's name was Aldous Kerr. He had been working territorial land claims for 20 years, and his letter was precise and careful in the way of a man who had learned that careless words in his profession cost people their homes. He wrote that the survey discrepancy Alderman had described was a known tactic. That in the past 18 months, 3 separate land challenges in the territory had used identical language filing. Error acreage, mismatch, boundary, irregularity, and that in each case the challenge had originated from documents filed at the county level after the original homestead claim. He wrote that he would come to Millbrook himself, that he wanted to walk the north parcel boundary personally, and that Nathaniel should file nothing and sign nothing until he arrived. He wrote one other thing at the bottom of the letter in a slightly different hand, as if he'd added it after folding the page, and then opened it again. "Do not let the other party know I am coming." Nathaniel set the letter down on the table. "He knows something," Charlotte said. "He knows more than he's putting in writing," Nathaniel said. "Which means he doesn't trust the post." They looked at each other across the table. "When can he come?" she asked. "He didn't say. Soon, I think." Nathaniel folded the letter carefully and put it inside his coat. "Until then, we wait. We keep working," Charlotte said. "And we say nothing." He nodded once. She went back to the office, but waiting, she discovered, was its own kind of action. Every day she was at the ranch, she was watching who rode past on the road north, watching whether Clem came in with any reports from town, watching Nathaniel's face for the particular set of his jaw that meant something was wrong. She had gotten very good at reading Nathaniel's face. It was Clem who brought the news on a Monday, which was not one of her scheduled days, but Mrs. Gable had sent word out with the grain delivery because Mrs. Gable had decided, without consulting anyone, that Charlotte needed to know immediately. Alderman had been to see Reverend Miller. Charlotte heard this and felt the specific chill of a man who was working every angle. "The Reverend," she said. Clem chewed, nodded. "Asked him about you, where you'd come from, what your situation was." He squinted at her. "Reverend Miller didn't tell him much. He's a close man. But Alderman knew you were Catholic somehow." Charlotte thought about who might have mentioned that. Mrs. Gable, the station master. Any one of a dozen people who had no reason to be careful with a detail that seemed so harmless. "What did he do with it?" she asked. "Don't know yet," Clem said. "Mrs. Gable thought you should know." She thanked him, and she went to find Nathaniel. He was in the barn. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on, the way he absorbed information first and reacted second, without the defensive flaring that made some men useless in a crisis. "He's building a picture of you," Nathaniel said when she'd finished. "Yes, trying to find something to use." She paused. "A woman who came west to meet a man who didn't exist. No local family, no husband. Catholic, which means Reverend Miller won't speak for me the way he would for a member of his congregation." She said it flatly because it was the arithmetic of her situation, not a complaint. "He's calculating my credibility." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "Why would he need to attack your credibility?" "Because I've made you harder to isolate," she said. "And whatever he's planning requires you to be alone." A silence stretched between them. "Charlotte," Nathaniel said, and then stopped. "What?" He looked like he was choosing something. She had noticed that about him there were moments when he arrived at the edge of a sentence and then decided not to cross it. She had learned not to push, but this time he crossed it. "If Alderman is going after your reputation," he said, "you need to be in a position where he can't damage you easily." He stopped again. His voice, when he continued, was very even. "If we were married, he couldn't use your situation against you. You'd be my wife. You'd have standing in this county." Charlotte did not move. She heard the words. She held them carefully, the way you held something you weren't sure was real. "That's a practical argument for marriage," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is it the only argument you're making?" He looked at her. His face was that open, unguarded thing she only saw at certain moments when he talked about the north pasture fence, in a way that was really about whether he trusted her judgment when he sat across the desk from her like two people having a conversation. "No," he said. "But I thought it was the one you might accept." Charlotte felt something move through her that was too complicated to name. Not quite joy, not quite grief, something that had both of them threaded through it. She thought about the photograph in the ledger. She thought about a woman she'd never met who had her hand on her boy's shoulder in a way that was entirely natural. She thought about what it would mean to step into a life that had been built for someone else. I need to think, she said. Of course, he said immediately. No pressure, no performance. She went back to the house. She sat at the desk in the office, but she didn't open the ledger. She sat with her hands flat on the desktop and she thought. She had come here for a man who turned out to be a fiction, and now she was being asked not by a letter, not by a construction of careful handwriting on expensive paper, but by a man standing in a barn with dirt on his boots and honesty in his face to stay. She did not know if she was ready. She did not know if it mattered whether she was ready. She slept on it. 2 nights, which was as long as she could stand. On Wednesday evening, she found Nathaniel on the porch after supper. He had started eating supper at the house on the days she stayed late. Another of those small adjustments that had happened without announcement. And she sat down beside him, not close, just in the same vicinity, the way they'd learned to be near each other without it requiring an explanation. I'll accept, she said, on conditions. He turned to look at her. I'm not your housekeeper, she said. I'll manage the accounts and I'll run the household because those are things I'm good at, and I want to do them. But not as an employee, as someone with equal say in how this ranch operates. That's fair, he said. And I need you to be honest with me, she said. About the land, about the finances, about everything Alderman does. I won't be managed. I won't be protected from information. I know that, he said. And the way he said it quiet direct told her he actually did. And she stopped. And, he said. She looked at him. I know I'm not her, she said. I know this isn't what you planned. I know there's grief in that house that isn't mine to touch. She paused. I don't need you to pretend otherwise. I just need you to let me be what I actually am, and not what you thought your life was going to look like. Something moved across his face that she didn't have language for yet. Charlotte, he said, I stopped being able to pretend 4 years ago. He looked out at the dark. What I know is, since you've been here, I've started keeping accounts again. He paused. That might not sound like much. It sounds like a great deal, she said quietly. He turned back to her. Then yes, he said, to your conditions. All of them. She nodded. All right then, she said. They sat there on this porch for another few minutes, in the particular silence that was theirs. Not empty, not awkward, just inhabited. And then Charlotte went inside because it was getting cold, and Nathaniel stayed a little longer, and she thought from the kitchen that he was probably looking at the dark, the way a man looked at something that had changed while he wasn't watching. They were married on a Friday 8 days later by Reverend Miller. It was not a ceremony with flowers or music or a dress made for the occasion. Charlotte wore her good gray dress, the one she'd saved for meeting Daniel Whitcomb, which she had decided to reclaim for a better purpose. Miss Darby stood with her. Clem stood with Nathaniel. Mrs. Gable sat in the front pew and wore an expression of someone who had expected this outcome and was allowing herself a degree of private satisfaction. Reverend Miller was a thin, serious man who performed the words of the ceremony as if they meant something which Charlotte appreciated. She had been to weddings where the Reverend moved through the language the way you moved through a familiar chore efficiently without presence. Miller was not like that. He looked at both of them when he spoke the words. When he said, "Will you have this woman to love and to cherish in sickness and in health as long as you both shall live?" Nathaniel said, "I will." And he said it to her, not to the Reverend. And Charlotte felt the ground solidify beneath her in a way she hadn't felt since she'd stepped off the train in Millbrook. When Miller said, "You may now," Nathaniel leaned forward and kissed her brief and deliberate, and she felt his hand at the side of her face just for a moment, and then it was done. Mrs. Gable produced a cake from somewhere. Miss Darby cried a little, which she apologized for, and which Charlotte told her not to. Clem shook Nathaniel's hand and said, "About time," which was more words than he usually managed in a week. Charlotte stood in the small church hall with a piece of cake she wasn't eating, and she thought, this is real. This is not a letter. This is not a constructed hope. This man stood next to me and said I will, and he meant it. And I know he meant it because I have been reading his face for 2 months, and I know what his truth looks like. It felt nothing like what she'd imagined back in Lowell, reading Daniel Whitcomb's slanted handwriting. It felt better. Quieter and stranger and better. The first night she slept in the Cross Ranch house as its mistress, she lay awake listening to the sounds of a building. She was still learning the particular creak of the third stair, the way the wind moved around the north corner differently than the south. Nathaniel was across the hall. They had agreed, without having to say it, that this would be a gradual thing, that there was no need to rush the parts that required trust, and trust required time. She lay awake and thought about the house around her. She thought about the closed curtains in the front rooms, the furniture that wasn't sat on, the yard that had gone to neglect. She thought, I could open those curtains. Not tonight, but soon. She fell asleep thinking about small changes and what they meant, and she slept without dreaming, which she took as a sign of something. Aldous Kerr arrived on a Wednesday 3 weeks after they were married. He was a compact, weathered man with spectacles and a leather satchel that he carried everywhere and never let out of his reach, which told Charlotte something about what was in it. He came to the ranch directly, which meant he had not gone into town first, which meant he was serious about not being seen before he had to be. Nathaniel brought him to the kitchen. Charlotte made coffee and put it in front of him and sat down across the table, and Kerr looked at her with the assessing look of a man who was deciding whether to speak plainly in front of her. My wife manages my accounts and has corresponded with the Territorial Land Office on my behalf, Nathaniel said. She stays. Kerr looked at Nathaniel, then back at Charlotte. Then he opened his satchel. What he put on the table was not a survey map. It was a legal document. Thick official with a stamp Charlotte recognized as a territorial court stamp. This, Kerr said, is what Alderman filed 2 weeks ago at the county office. He turned it so they could read it. He claims the north parcel of the Cross Ranch was homesteaded on disputed land, that the original 1871 survey placed the north boundary incorrectly, and that approximately 40 acres of what you believe to be your property is legally unclaimed territory. Charlotte read the document. She read it carefully, and she read it again. This document references a survey map, she said. Survey number 4471-B. Yes, Kerr said. I've been through every filing related to this ranch, she said. There is no survey numbered 4471-B in the county records. I've seen the county filings. I have copies. Kerr looked at her sharply. You have copies. I requested certified copies of all county filings related to this property 6 weeks ago, she said, before I knew about Alderman's specific claim, as part of standard account management. She stood up. I'll get them. She went to the office. She came back with the folder she had assembled, methodical, organized, labeled in her clear hand. She set it in front of Kerr. He opened it. He looked through it with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Then he went still. Survey 4471-B does not exist in these certified records, he said. No, Charlotte said. It doesn't. Which means Alderman filed a document referencing a survey that either doesn't exist or was created after the fact. Kerr looked up. He looked at Charlotte with an expression that was past professional and into something closer to outright respect. Mrs. Cross, do you know what you have here? I know what I have, she said. The question is whether a territorial court will act on it. With these certified copies as evidence, Kerr said, and my independent survey of the actual boundary, yes, I believe they will. He closed the folder. This is fraud, documented, verifiable fraud. He looked at Nathaniel. Alderman has done this before. I know of 2 other cases, but no one had the documentation. We have the documentation, Charlotte said. Nathaniel was looking at her. He had been looking at her since she came back from the office with the folder. His face had that quality. It got sometimes not surprised exactly, but something deeper than surprise. Something that was reckoning with itself. You knew, he said, not an accusation. Something quieter than that. I knew what Alderman was likely doing, she said. I didn't know the specific document, but I knew the pattern, so I prepared for the pattern. He was quiet for a moment. "You prepared for this before you even knew alderman was a problem," he said. "I prepared for the possibility that someone might try to use legal documents against you," she said. "Because that's what I've seen men do. And I wanted you to have a record that couldn't be challenged." He looked at her across the table in his kitchen, in his house. The house that had been empty for 4 years and now had coffee on the stove and a legal folder on the table, and a woman who had arrived with 40 cents and 2 books and a burned letter and had somehow, without anyone planning it, become the reason it was going to be all right. "Charlotte," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. "We still need Kerr to do the survey," she said, because she didn't quite trust herself to hear the rest of what his voice had in it right now. "And we need to file a response to Alderman's claim before the county deadline." "When is the deadline?" Kerr asked. 3 weeks, she said. She had already looked it up. Kerr nodded. He picked up his satchel. "I'll start the survey tomorrow. I can have a certified map ready in 2 weeks. He stood. "You'll want a lawyer to file the response. There's a man in Billings, Forsyth, Howard Forsyth. He's argued territorial fraud cases before." "Write his name down," Charlotte said. She pushed a piece of paper across the table. Kerr wrote it. He looked at Charlotte one more time before he left with that expression of a man revising an assumption he'd held for a long time. "Where did you come from?" he said. "Massachusetts," she said. "Lowell." "Milltown." "Yes." He nodded as if that explained something. "They teach you to read the fine print in mill towns," he said. "They teach you that nobody else will," she said. He left. She was alone in the kitchen with Nathaniel. He hadn't moved. She started stacking the papers. "I'll write to Forsyth today," she said. "If we send it express—" "Charlotte," he said. She stopped. He came around the table, and he stood in front of her close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and what she saw there was not complicated. It was not guarded. It was just open. The way he'd been in the church when he said, "I will," directly to her and not to the reverend. "I don't have words for what you've done," he said. "You don't need words," she said. "We just need to win the case." "No." He shook his head slightly. "Not just the case." He looked at her steadily. "I haven't. I went 4 years in that house without wanting anything. I stopped keeping accounts because what was the point of accounting for anything?" He stopped, swallowed. "You walked in here and made it matter again. The land matters. The accounts matter." He paused and his voice dropped. "I matter. I hadn't felt that in a very long time." Charlotte felt the words settle into her chest like something finding its weight. She thought about a woman in a photograph with her hand on her boy's shoulder. She thought about the curtains she had not yet opened, and how she would, and how the light would change when she did. "You matter," she said quietly. "You mattered before I got here. You just needed someone to act like you did." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, held it the way you held something you were grateful was there. She let him. They stood in the kitchen of a house that was becoming a home, and outside the surveyor was walking the north parcel boundary with his measuring tape and his leather satchel. And 3 weeks away was a court deadline that they were going to meet. And Gerald Alderman did not yet know what was coming for him. But he was going to find out. Charlotte picked up her pen. She wrote the letter to Howard Forsyth in Billings. She wrote it in the clear, direct language of a woman who had been reading fine print for years, and who understood better than most that the law was a weapon and a shield both, and it depended entirely on who knew how to hold it. Howard Forsyth arrived from Billings on a Tuesday, and Charlotte knew within the first 5 minutes of meeting him that he was exactly the right man. He was tall 60s, with the kind of face that had been argued at and argued back so many times it had settled into permanent composure. He carried a briefcase that looked older than some buildings in Millbrook. He shook Charlotte's hand first, which told her he'd read her letter carefully enough to understand who had actually written it. He sat at the kitchen table, opened his briefcase, and said without preamble, "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out because you think it's small. In my experience, the small things are where the fraud lives." So Charlotte told him. All of it. The sequence, the timeline, the certified county records, the non-existent survey 4471-B, Kerr's independent assessment, the deputy assessor Whitfield, the pattern Kerr had described in other cases. She had written it all out in order in her clear hand on 6 pages she had prepared the night before, and she slid those pages across the table to him as she talked. Forsyth read while she spoke. He turned pages without looking up. He made small marks in the margins with a pencil he produced from his breast pocket. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Forsyth looked up. He looked at Nathaniel, then at Charlotte. "Mrs. Cross, you said you have certified copies of the county filings." "Yes." "Certified when?" 6 weeks before Alderman filed his claim. He tapped his pencil on the table once. "That is the single most important fact in this case. Do you understand why?" "Because it establishes the state of the record before Alderman made his filing," Charlotte said. "It proves that Survey 4471-B was not in the county record at the time my copies were certified. Any document referencing it must have been created afterward." Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you learn to think like this?" "Milltown," she said, "and necessity." He almost smiled. "Right." He closed the folder. "Here is where we stand. Alderman's claim is fraudulent, and your documentation proves it. The territorial court will hear the case. What I cannot guarantee is the timing territorial court moves slowly, or what Alderman will do between now and the hearing." "What can he do?" Nathaniel asked. "He can apply pressure," Forsyth said. "He can file ancillary motions to delay. He can approach witnesses. He can attempt to have the certified records challenged on procedural grounds." He paused. "And he can escalate. In my experience, men like Alderman become more dangerous when they realize they're losing." The kitchen was very quiet. "How much more dangerous?" Charlotte asked. "Difficult to say. He has resources. He has local connections. He knows this territory better than the territorial court does." Forsyth looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Cross, I want to ask you something directly. Is there anything about your own background, your personal history, anything before you came to Montana, that Alderman could use to complicate this case, to attack your credibility?" She knew what he was asking. She had been waiting for someone to ask it. "I came to Millbrook to marry a man named Daniel Whitcomb," she said. "He was already married. I was deceived. I stayed in Millbrook because I had no resources to leave, and because I found honest work." She paused. "Alderman knows this. He has been asking about me around town since shortly after I became involved in the ranch accounts." Forsyth nodded slowly. "He could attempt to characterize you as a woman of uncertain position who arrived under irregular circumstances and has inserted herself into a property dispute for personal gain. He could try," Charlotte said. "But I was married to Nathaniel 3 weeks ago before Alderman filed his claim. And I have 6 weeks of certified records that I gathered before any of this became a dispute." She looked at Forsyth calmly. "The timeline doesn't support his narrative. I was doing my job before I knew there was a case." Forsyth put his pencil in his pocket. He looked at Nathaniel. "Your wife," he said, "is an exceptional woman." "I know that," Nathaniel said. She looked at her hands on the table and said nothing, because some things you just had to let pass without answering. 3 days after Forsyth left, Gerald Alderman came to the ranch. He came in the middle of the afternoon, which was deliberate a time when he might expect a rancher to be out in the fields and a woman to be alone in the house. He did not know Charlotte Cross, but he had miscalculated the woman he was dealing with from the very beginning. She heard the horse. She looked through the front window and saw him dismount. She went to the kitchen doorway and said, "Nathaniel." He came in from the back, took one look at her face. "Alderman, Alderman." He moved to the front door. She went to stand behind him and to the left, not hiding, not retreating. "Present." Alderman knocked. Nathaniel opened the door. Alderman was a well-dressed man, 50s, with the specific kind of confidence that came not from physical size, but from a lifetime of being the person in the room who held the money. He had a pleasant face, which Charlotte found more unsettling than an unpleasant one. Charming men who did bad things were more dangerous than ugly ones, because the charm was the warning system they'd disabled in everyone around them. "Nathaniel," he said warmly, as if they were neighbors with no particular conflict. "I was hoping we might talk. You filed a fraudulent land claim against me 2 weeks ago," Nathaniel said. "We don't have anything to talk about." Alderman's eyes moved to Charlotte. They assessed her with the rapid efficiency of a man who made calculations quickly. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "I imagine you have," she said. "I wonder if you've heard much about me," he said. "Beyond what your husband might have told you. I wonder if you know the full picture of what's happening in this valley." "I know the full picture," she said. "I've read every document related to it." Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, he was too controlled for alarm, but a recalibration. "Then you'll understand that this is a business matter," he said. "Nothing personal. The railroad is coming. Land values will change dramatically. I'm offering Nathaniel a chance to benefit from that change rather than be caught on the wrong side of it. By filing a fraudulent survey and challenging his land title," Charlotte said. "By opening a negotiation," Alderman said smoothly. "The negotiation," Charlotte said, "ended when you filed a document referencing a survey that did not exist in the county record." She looked at him steadily. "We have certified copies of the county record from before your filing. Survey 4471-B was not in those records. That makes your claim fraudulent. We have a lawyer, we have an independent surveyor, and we have a hearing date at the territorial court." She paused. "That is the full picture." Alderman was very still. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone, not replaced by anger, something colder than anger. "You're a clever woman," he said. "I'll give you that. But you've been here less than 3 months. You don't know how things work out here." "I know how land fraud works," she said. "I know what happened to the Hendersons and the widow Marsh. I know about Deputy Assessor Whitfield. And our lawyer in Billings knows all of it too." She kept her voice even. "So, if you're here to tell me that I don't understand this territory's power structures, I do. I simply don't find them as permanent as you'd like me to." The silence was long and specific. Alderman looked at Nathaniel. "You want to let your wife speak for you?" "My wife," Nathaniel said, "says everything I would have said, only better. So yes." Alderman put his hat back on. The pleasant face had gone entirely now. What was underneath was not rage, but something more dangerous, the focused attention of a man who had just added something to his list. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Charlotte agreed. "It isn't. But the next stage of it happens in a territorial court, not on my porch." He left. Nathaniel closed the door. The silence in the house was different from the silence that was usually there, charged electric still vibrating from what had just happened. "Charlotte," Nathaniel said. "I know," she said. "He's going to come back at you harder." "I know that too." She was already moving toward the office. "Which is why I need to write to Forsyth today and tell him Alderman came here. He needs to know that Alderman knows about the certified records. It changes his legal strategy." She sat down at the desk. Her hands, she noticed again, were entirely steady. She wrote the letter. The escalation came faster than even Forsyth had predicted. It came not through legal channels, but through the town, which was how Alderman preferred to work quietly with no fingerprints. Mrs. Henderson came to the ranch on a Thursday morning without sending word ahead, which alone told Charlotte something was wrong. She was a stout woman of 50, with capable hands and direct eyes, and she came into the kitchen and sat down and said, "There are things being said about you in town, Charlotte. You need to know." Charlotte set down her coffee. "What things?" "That you came here under false pretenses. That you knew Whitcomb was married and came anyway, hoping to find a situation." Mrs. Henderson's voice was tight with anger. Not at Charlotte. Charlotte understood immediately, but at the thing she was having to say. "That you attached yourself to Nathaniel Cross deliberately, because you knew about the land and the railroad and thought you could position yourself advantageously." The words landed in the kitchen like stones dropped into still water. "Who is saying this?" Charlotte asked. "It's not one person. That's how he does it. It gets said in the general store, at the saloon, at the church social. Nobody says it directly to your face because nobody wants to be the one to say it, but everyone hears it, and some people believe it, because they don't know you well enough not to." Charlotte sat very still. She thought about what this meant. Not emotionally, she allowed herself that later, but strategically right now, because that was what the situation required. If her credibility was successfully undermined in Millbrook, it affected the court case. Not legally. Forsyth had told her the certified record stood regardless of what people thought of her, but practically. Community character witnesses. The judge's impressions. The jury pool, if it came to that. Alderman was not stupid. He could not win in court on the evidence. So he was trying to poison the ground around the court. "What do people who know me say?" Charlotte asked. "Mrs. Gable has been very firm," Mrs. Henderson said. "Miss Darby as well. Reverend Miller said from the pulpit on Sunday that he had observed Mrs. Cross's conduct since her arrival and found it entirely proper, which for Miller, who says almost nothing about specific people, is practically a declaration of love." Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest. "And Mr. Henderson?" Charlotte asked. Mrs. Henderson's face did something complicated. "My husband," she said carefully, "has been talking to your lawyer in Billings. He and the widow Marsh both. They have their own history with aldermen, and when Forsyth contacted them, they have documents too, Charlotte. Not as airtight as yours, but documents. Evidence of the same pattern." She paused. "Forsyth is building something larger than just your case." Charlotte stared at her. "He didn't tell us," she said slowly. "He wrote to us directly," Mrs. Henderson said, "after you gave him our names as people who'd been affected by aldermen. He said you suggested it." Charlotte had in fact suggested it, a single line in her first letter to Forsyth. Almost a footnote. There are other families in this valley who may have been similarly defrauded and who may have documentation of their own. She had not followed up on it. She had assumed it was too slim a thread. Forsyth had pulled it. "He's combining the cases," Charlotte said. "He's building a pattern," Mrs. Henderson said, "which is harder to dismiss than a single dispute. He said if he can show the territorial court that Alderman has used the same fraudulent survey tactic in 3 separate cases, it stops being a business dispute and starts being a criminal matter." The kitchen was very quiet. "When is the hearing?" Charlotte asked. 3 weeks, Mrs. Henderson said. Forsyth moved to have it expedited. Given the combined evidence, the court granted it. 3 weeks. Charlotte sat with that. Then she stood up because sitting down was not the right response to this news. "Thank you for coming," she said. "And thank Mrs. Gable and Miss Darby. And Reverend Miller." She paused. "You didn't have to come out here to tell me this. You're in this because of my family too," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "That makes it shared business." She stood. "Charlotte, are you all right?" The question caught her sideways. She had been managing. She had been very competent and very steady and very focused on the next action and the question. "Are you all right?" asked in that plain maternal way, cut straight through all of it. "I'm angry," Charlotte said honestly, "that a man can construct a lie about who I am and spread it through a town the same way he constructs fraudulent surveys, using people's willingness to believe what they're told." She paused. "I'm angry that being a woman who arrived alone makes me easier to slander." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Yes," she said. "That's the right thing to be." She left. Charlotte stood in the kitchen and let herself be angry for exactly 3 minutes, because that was all she could afford. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was in the barn. He heard the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The things being said in town," he said. Does it hurt you?" She looked at him. "It's designed to," she said. "Whether it does depends on whether I let it." "Charlotte." His voice was careful. "I'm asking if you're hurt." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. Some, because I know what it's like to have people look at you differently. I know that some of them won't unlearn it even after the case is won. She paused. But I also know it's not true, and I know who I am. Alderman is counting on me not knowing that clearly enough. Nathaniel crossed the barn and stood in front of her. He did not touch her. He had learned the vocabulary of what she needed when she needed to be held and when she needed to stand. Right now she was standing. I want to say something, he said. Then say it. When you came to my ranch the first time, he said, I told myself I needed someone to do the accounts. That was true. He paused. But I watched you walk in here and sit down at that desk and start working like it was the most natural thing you'd ever done. Like you'd been doing it your whole life, and the desk had always been there waiting. He looked at her steadily. I hadn't thought about the future in 4 years, not in a real way. The day you started working here, I started thinking about it again. He stopped. I need you to know that. Whatever Alderman says about why you're here, I need you to know the truth of it from me. Charlotte felt the words settle into her in the way true things did not, with drama, not with a rush, but with weight. The kind of weight that stays. I know, she said quietly. Nathaniel, I know. He nodded once. He went back to what he'd been doing. She went back to the house. She sat down at the desk. She looked at the office around her, the accounts in their ordered folders, the certified copies filed in sequence, the letter from Forsyth, the letter from Kerr, the building record of a case that was going to matter. She thought about Daniel Whitcomb. She had not thought about him in weeks, and she noticed this now with a kind of curious gratitude, that he had faded, that the shape he'd left in her life had been filled with something real, and she'd barely marked the transition. She thought about burning his letter in the tin basin. I trust you are resourceful enough to manage. She had managed. The second letter from Whitcomb arrived on a Monday, and this one was different. It was not addressed to Charlotte. It was addressed to Nathaniel Cross, and it had been sent to the ranch. Nathaniel brought it in from the mail delivery and set it on the desk without comment. She looked at the envelope. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the neat slanted script she had once called lovely. You know who this is? Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He looked at it. Do you want me to open it, or do you want to? She picked it up. She opened it. It was short. 2 paragraphs written in a careful legal tone that told her Whitcomb had either consulted someone or was trying to sound like he had. He wrote that he had become aware of Charlotte's marriage to Nathaniel Cross. He wrote that he had consulted with an associate and had been advised that Charlotte's journey to Millbrook constituted an implied contract of betrothal, and that her subsequent marriage to another party without formal dissolution of said implied contract might constitute a legal irregularity worth examining. He was threatening to challenge her marriage. Charlotte read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the desk very carefully. He's saying our marriage might be invalid, she said. Her voice was completely flat. Based on an implied contract from letters he wrote to me while he was already married to someone else. Nathaniel picked up the letter and read it himself. His face when he looked up was something she had not seen before, not the quiet anger of the alderman confrontations, but something deeper and colder. He can't actually do this, Nathaniel said. He can file something, she said. Whether it holds is a different question. But if Alderman is advising him or funding him... She stopped. Charlotte, Nathaniel said sharply. Alderman, she said. This came from Alderman. Whitcomb didn't think of this himself. He doesn't have the resources or the legal knowledge. But Alderman does. And if Alderman can manufacture a challenge to our marriage, he can complicate the land case. Married couples have different legal standing than unmarried parties. If he can raise enough doubt about whether we're legally married, he can create grounds to challenge your standing in the land case, Nathaniel finished. His jaw was set. Yes, she said. They looked at each other. Write to Forsyth, Nathaniel said. I'm already composing it, she said. She wrote for 40 minutes, barely pausing. She laid out the connection between Whitcomb's letter and Alderman's legal strategy with the same methodical precision she brought to account books. She attached Whitcomb's letter. She noted the timing 10 days before the territorial court hearing. She noted that Whitcomb was in Billings, which was where Alderman's primary legal associates operated. She sealed the letter. She handed it to Nathaniel. "Write it in yourself," she said. "Don't trust the mail delivery. Give it to the station master to send express and watch him send it." He looked at her. "You think Alderman has someone at the postal office?" "I think Alderman has someone everywhere he thinks it's useful to have someone," she said. "We can't afford to assume otherwise." He took the letter. He went to saddle his horse. At the door he turned back. "Charlotte." She looked up. "When this is over," he said, "I want to take you somewhere. Somewhere that isn't this ranch and isn't Millbrook and isn't anything to do with aldermen or surveys or county records." He paused. "Just somewhere you can breathe." She looked at him for a long moment. "Where?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm going to think about it." He rode out. She sat at the desk and looked at the empty doorway and felt something move through her that was not strategy, not planning, not the focused management of a crisis, something softer and more complicated and entirely its own. She picked up her pen. She wrote 3 more letters that afternoon to Forsyth's associate in Helena, to the widow Marsh directly, and to Aldous Kerr confirming his testimony at the hearing. She had the system of it now, the rhythm. The way each letter connected to the others, like the columns of an account book that had to balance. She was still writing when Nathaniel came back from town. He came to the office doorway. "Express mail confirmed," he said. "Forsyth should have it by morning." "Good," she said. He leaned against the doorframe. "You've been at that desk for 5 hours." "I know." "Charlotte." "Almost done." He went to the kitchen. 20 minutes later, he appeared with a plate and set it on the corner of the desk. Bread and cold beef and an apple, arranged with the unpretentious practicality of a man who had decided she needed to eat and was not going to make a speech about it. She looked at the plate. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Eat," he said, and went back to the kitchen. She ate. She finished the last letter. She sealed it and set it with the others and sat back in the chair and looked at the room around her. Her room now, her desk, her ordered folders, her building record of a truth that was going to stand up in a territorial court in 9 days. The house was quiet. From the kitchen she could hear Nathaniel moving the low sound of him, the particular presence of a person who had stopped needing to fill silence because silence was no longer empty. She thought, "This is what I was looking for when I read those letters. Not Whitcomb. Not what I thought I was going to. This. Exactly this." She blew out the lamp. She went to find her husband. Forsyth's response came in 2 days, which meant he had read her letter the morning it arrived and written back immediately, which meant he understood exactly what she'd understood. His letter was 3 pages. The first page addressed Whitcomb's claim directly. He had already researched it, and his conclusion was unambiguous. An implied contract of betrothal was not enforceable under territorial law when one party to the alleged contract had been legally married to a third party at the time the letters were written. Whitcomb had no standing. Any challenge he filed would be dismissed before it reached a judge's desk, and filing it would expose Whitcomb himself to a fraud claim for the original deception. The second page was the one that mattered. Forsyth had traced the connection. It had taken him 2 days and 2 associates, but he had founded a land acquisition company registered in Billings with Gerald Alderman listed as a managing partner, and listed as a secondary investor with a smaller but documented stake, Daniel Whitcomb. Charlotte read that line 3 times. Whitcomb and Alderman. Connected. Not coincidentally, structurally. Whitcomb had been sending letters to women in eastern mill towns for 2 years. Women without local family, without property, without the kind of standing that made them hard to dismiss. He sent letters built. Hope brought women west, and whatever happened to those women after they arrived was not his concern. But what he had built in the process was a supply of desperate people, in unfamiliar territory, easy to exploit, easy to silence. She thought about the woman from Ohio, the woman from Tennessee. She thought about what Alderman's operation needed: a steady flow of distressed newcomers who could be leveraged, manipulated, used as witnesses or foils, or simply discarded. And Whitcomb had provided the machinery for it at a distance with perfect deniability. She put the letter down on the desk. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and walked to the kitchen where Nathaniel was eating breakfast, and she set it in front of him and waited while he read. He read it once fast. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again, slow. When he looked up, his face was absolutely still. He knew Alderman, Nathaniel said. He was an investor in Alderman's company, Charlotte said. The letters he wrote to me, to the others, they were part of a pattern. Bring vulnerable women west. Isolate them. Use them or discard them depending on what was useful. Nathaniel set the letter down. Charlotte, I know, she said. I know what it means. It means you were targeted, he said, not randomly. Someone looked at women in mill towns and calculated that you were easier, she said. Yes. She sat down across from him. It's a particular kind of cruelty, isn't it? Not the shouting kind, not the violent kind. The kind that uses your own hope against you. She paused. He read enough about who I was to write letters that sounded exactly like what I needed to hear. That takes attention. That takes a specific meanness of spirit. Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression that had moved past anger into something more complicated. Guilt, she recognized, which was misplaced but real. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't feel responsible for what was done to me before you knew me. She looked at him steadily. You didn't write those letters. You offered to carry my trunk and asked nothing for it. Those are not the same kind of man. He was quiet. What I need to know, she said, is whether Forsyth can use this, the connection between Whitcomb and Alderman. Nathaniel picked up the letter again and looked at the third page, which Charlotte hadn't mentioned yet. He read it. Then he looked up. Forsyth wants to present this at the hearing. Yes, she said. He says it establishes a coordinated fraud scheme, not just one bad survey. A deliberate, multi-pronged operation involving at least two parties acting in concert across multiple counties. Which makes it a criminal matter, Charlotte said. Not just a civil one, which means the territorial court can refer it to the federal district court. Which means Alderman doesn't just lose the land case, he faces criminal prosecution. Nathaniel set the letter down flat on the table. That's a long way from where we started, he said. Where we started, Charlotte said, was me standing on a platform with 40 cents and no plan. She paused. The documentation was always there. Someone just had to look for it. He looked at her across the table in the morning kitchen of the house that had been empty, and was empty no longer. And he said very quietly, I want to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without deflecting. She folded her hands. All right. You saved this ranch, he said. You saved it before we were married, when you were just a woman doing accounts because you had the foresight to get certified records before anyone told you to. And then you saved it again when you wrote to Forsyth and Kerr and the widow Marsh and everyone else, and you built the kind of case that a man with 20 years in territorial court called the strongest documentation he'd ever seen. He paused. And I have not said plainly enough, I have not said it clearly, that what you did is the reason we're sitting here instead of watching Alderman walk away with 40 acres of my land. His voice was even but weighted. So I'm saying it now. Thank you. Charlotte, thank you. She looked at him. She had spent 4 years in a mill town, being precisely efficiently useful, and receiving in return the wage that had been agreed upon, and nothing else. She had come 2,000 miles for a man who had used her sincerity as an instrument. She had arrived in Millbrook with 40 cents and no plan, and had built in 3 months, a life and a case, and something that felt steadily, quietly, undramatically like home. She was not going to cry in the kitchen. You're welcome, she said, and meant it completely. The territorial court hearing was set for a Thursday, and the whole of Millbrook seemed to know it. They rode in together in the wagon, she and Nathaniel side by side on the bench, Clem driving, nobody saying much. Charlotte had dressed carefully not to impress, but to be unimpeachable, her good gray dress, her mother's brooch at the collar. She carried the full documentation folder in a leather satchel she had purchased specifically for this purpose. Forsyth had told her to bring everything original and copy both. The territorial court convened in the largest room in the county building, and when Charlotte walked in, she saw that it was full. Not with strangers, with people she knew. Mrs. Gable was seated in the second row with her hands folded and her best hat on, looking like a woman who had no doubt about the outcome and had dressed accordingly. Miss Darby was beside her. The Hendersons were there, and the widow Marsh and 3 other families she recognized from Forsyth's combined case filing. Reverend Miller sat near the back, with the careful stillness of a man who was there to witness and would remember everything. Alderman was already there. He sat with 2 lawyers Charlotte hadn't seen before, brought in from somewhere larger, somewhere he'd decided would give him more professional gravity. He did not look at her when she came in. Forsyth was at the front arranging papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had prepared for every possibility and was not afraid of any of them. When he saw Charlotte, he nodded once and she nodded back. The judge was a territorial appointee named Callaway Sixties. Compact, with the quality of someone who had presided over too many cases in rooms too small for what they contained and had developed as a result an absolute intolerance for wasted time. He called the room to order at precisely 9 o'clock. He did not introduce the case at length. He had the documents. He had read them. He began. Alderman's lawyers went first, which was their right as the filing party. The senior one was smooth and practiced, and spoke at length about survey irregularities and homestead filing standards and the complexity of territorial land records. He used a great many words. He did not produce any document that Charlotte had not already accounted for. She sat very still beside Nathaniel and watched Forsyth's face while the other lawyer spoke. Forsyth was making small notes on a pad. His expression was the expression of a man listening to an argument he already knows how to dismantle. When Alderman's lawyer finished, Callaway looked at Forsyth. "Counselor." Forsyth stood. He was not smooth. He did not use many words. He presented the certified county records. Charlotte's certified records obtained 6 weeks before Alderman's filing, and he explained in the plain language of a man who had made his career, making complicated things clear. Why Survey 4471-B could not have existed in the county record before Alderman's people put it there. He presented Kerr's independent survey. He presented the Territorial Land Office record from Nathaniel's original 1871 homestead filing. He presented 3 affidavits from the Henderson family, the widow Marsh, and 1 other affected party, each describing an identical sequence of events using identical legal language that no 3 independent parties could have coincidentally arrived at unless the language had come from a common source. And then he presented the corporate filing from Billings, Gerald Alderman, managing partner, Daniel Whitcomb, secondary investor. He let the room sit with that for a moment. Then he said, "Your Honor, what we have before this court is not a survey dispute. It is a coordinated fraud scheme operating across multiple counties using forged documents and county-level corruption to strip legally settled homesteaders of their land. The evidence demonstrates that this scheme involved not fewer than 2 parties acting in explicit coordination, and that it has affected not fewer than 4 properties in this territory." He paused. "We are asking not only for dismissal of the fraudulent claim against the Cross property, but for referral of this matter to the Federal District Court for criminal investigation." The room was very quiet. Alderman's senior lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is a land dispute hearing, not a criminal proceeding." "Sit down," Callaway said. The lawyer sat down. Callaway looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at them for a long time. The room held its breath. "I have a question," Callaway said, "for Mrs. Cross." Charlotte felt Nathaniel's hand find hers under the table. She stood. "Mrs. Cross." Callaway said, "You gathered the certified county records in question. When did you request them, and what was your stated reason for the request?" "I requested them 6 weeks before Alderman's filing, Your Honor," she said. I stated that I was conducting a standard account review of the property's land-related filings as part of my work managing the ranch records. You were not at that time aware of any pending legal challenge? No, Your Honor. There was no pending challenge at that time. I gathered them as part of ordinary due diligence. And it was ordinary practice for you to request certified copies, rather than simply reviewing the records in person. Yes, Your Honor. Certified copies create a time-stamped record that can be used to verify the state of the original filing at a given point in time. I was trained to create verifiable records in my previous work. Calloway looked at her over the top of his glasses. Where was your previous work? A textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, Your Honor. I managed accounts and compliance records. He made a note. Thank you, Mrs. Cross. You may sit. She sat. Nathaniel's hand was still holding hers. Calloway gathered his papers. He did not retire to consider. He looked at the room, at Alderman, at Forsyth, at the family seated in the rows behind, at the full weight of what was in front of him, and he spoke. The claim filed by the Alderman Land Acquisition Company against the north parcel of the Cross Ranch is dismissed, he said. The documentation presented by the claimant references a survey record that did not exist in the certified county filing at the time of the original homestead claim, and that cannot be authenticated as contemporaneous with the filing it purports to support. The claim is therefore fraudulent on its face. He paused. This matter is referred to the Federal District Court for investigation of coordinated land fraud across multiple territorial counties. The court will issue formal referral documents within the week. All parties named in the Forsyth filing are to make themselves available to federal investigators. He looked directly at Alderman. Including those parties who are not present today. He closed the folder. We're adjourned. The room erupted, not in chaos, in the specific sound of people who have been holding their breath all at once, letting it go. Mrs. Gable made a sound that was not quite a word, but conveyed everything. Miss Darby grabbed Mrs. Henderson's arm. Reverend Miller bowed his head in a way that might have been prayer and might have been relief. Charlotte sat absolutely still for one full second. Then Nathaniel turned to her and said, "Charlotte," and she turned to look at him. And what she saw on his face was not triumph. It was something much quieter and more permanent than triumph. It was the face of a man who had been in the dark for 4 years and had walked without planning it and without expecting it back into the light. She felt her composure make a small, controlled fracture. "We won," she said, as if she needed to hear herself say it. "We won," he said. And then he did something she had not seen him do before. He smiled fully without holding anything back, and it changed his face entirely into something younger and less weighted, and entirely his own. She laughed. Just briefly, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind she hadn't produced in longer than she could remember. And he laughed too quiet and low. And then Forsyth was shaking both their hands, and Mrs. Gable had somehow navigated the crowded room and was gripping Charlotte's arm and saying, "I told you, didn't I tell you," which she had in her way from the very beginning. Alderman was arrested by federal investigators 6 weeks later. Deputy Assessor Whitfield resigned his position the following week and left the territory before investigators arrived to question him, which Forsyth had predicted with weary accuracy. Daniel Whitcomb was charged in Billings with fraud and conspiracy. His case moved through the federal court slowly, as federal cases did, but it moved. Forsyth kept Charlotte informed. She read each letter, filed it, and did not spend more time on it than it deserved. She had other things to attend to. The ranch, her ranch now genuinely, in every way that mattered, had been given space to breathe. The land dispute resolved. Nathaniel turned his attention to the spring cattle plan, with an energy she hadn't seen before, a forward-looking purposefulness that told her the future had become for him something worth planning for. He spent an entire Sunday evening at the kitchen table, with her going over the expansion figures she'd laid out, asking good questions, disagreeing with her on one point about the eastern pasture costs, and being right, which she acknowledged without difficulty, because she had never needed to be right more than she needed the numbers to be right. She opened the front room curtains. She had thought about it since her first night in the house, and she did it on a Wednesday morning in early April when the light was coming in at exactly the angle that made it worth doing. She simply reached up and drew them back. The room filled with light. The furniture that had been sitting in the dark for 4 years looked different, not sad, just waiting. Nathaniel came in from outside and stopped when he saw the curtains open. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "All right," he said quietly. To the room, or to himself, or to the woman he'd lost, Charlotte was not sure, and it was not her question to ask. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair by the window. He sat there for a few minutes in the light, just sat, and Charlotte went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought him a cup and left it on the table beside him and went back to her work. That was how they loved each other. Not with speeches. With coffee brought at the right moment and curtains opened at the right time and a hand found under a table when a room needed holding together. Miss Darby came to dinner on Fridays. Mrs. Gable came on occasional Sundays and sat in the now illuminated front room and drank whatever she'd brought from the high shelf and talked about the town with the comprehensive authority of someone who had been watching it longer than most of its current residents had been alive. Clem ate in the kitchen on cold evenings and did not make small talk, but had stopped looking at Charlotte like an unverified quantity, which was his version of affection, and she accepted it as such. The widow Marsh wrote occasionally. So did Mrs. Henderson. The network that had formed around the court case did not dissolve after the verdict. It changed shape, became something quieter and more durable, the kind of community that existed. Not because people were forced together, but because they had chosen each other in a crisis and found they liked what they'd chosen. In June, Forsyth wrote to say that Whitcomb had pled guilty to 3 counts of fraud. The sentencing was pending. He would not be operating in the territory again. Charlotte read the letter at the kitchen table. She thought about who she had been when she read his first letter back in Lowell, in the thin light of a Milltown evening. She thought about the hope she had carried the whole length of the country so carefully in her hands. She thought about what it had felt like when it broke. She had been afraid on the platform in the cold that she was the kind of woman things happened to. That the world moved and she was moved by it, and that was all. She knew better now. Nathaniel came in from the yard and poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "Good news. Whitcomb pled guilty," she said. He looked at her. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it honestly. "Relieved," she said, and finished with it. "The way you feel when a debt is settled that you didn't choose to owe." She folded the letter. "I don't want to spend another thought on him. He got exactly as much of my life as I couldn't prevent, and not 1 minute more." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You once told me you didn't want to look backward." "I told you that when I was still deciding whether to be angry," she said. "I'm not angry anymore." "What are you?" he asked. She looked at him, at this man she had not planned and not expected, who had appeared on a dark horse on the night she had 40 cents and nowhere to go, who had asked for nothing and given steadily and loved her in the precise and practical way of someone who had learned that love was not a declaration, but an action repeated daily until it became the shape of a life. "Here," she said simply. "I'm here." He set down his coffee cup. He crossed the kitchen, and he took her face in both his hands, the way he had in the church that single moment, brief and complete, and he looked at her for a long moment with everything in his face that he normally kept careful and contained. "Stay," he said. The same word he'd said that night on the porch the first time, but different now. Fuller. "I'm already staying," she said. He kissed her. Not briefly this time. The child was born the following March. A girl. She had Charlotte's direct eyes and Nathaniel's capacity for stillness, and from the very first days, a quality of absolute self-possession that made Charlotte think she was going to be entirely capable of managing whatever the world produced. They named her Eleanor, after Charlotte's mother. Nathaniel held her on the first evening with the particular care of a man who had held a child before and loved the weight of it and lost that weight and thought he would never hold it again. He did not say anything. He sat in the chair by the front window, the window with the curtains open, the window that let in the afternoon light, and he held Eleanor against his chest, and looked at her with an expression that Charlotte did not try to interpret, because it belonged entirely to him, to his grief and his gratitude, and the private conversation he was having with everything he'd survived to get to this moment. She watched him from the doorway, and she thought, this is the house, not the timber and stone of it. This particular moment in the light, this man holding this child, this life that had been built not from promises but from endurance. She had come 2,000 miles for a lie, and arrived at the only truth that mattered. The ranch grew. The accounts stayed clean. Clem hired 2 younger hands and complained about both of them with consistent creativity. Mrs. Gable came to see Eleanor so often she may as well have moved in, which she would have denied entirely. Miss Darby became a regular at Sunday dinners, and eventually brought someone of her own, a quiet surveyor named Briggs, which pleased Charlotte in ways she didn't examine too closely. The north pasture fence held through 3 winters. Nathaniel fixed it himself every spring, and Charlotte brought him coffee when he did. And one day, Eleanor was old enough to stand beside him and hand him tools, which she did with focused seriousness that made Charlotte have to look away so no one would see her expression. She kept the accounts. She kept them the way she kept everything clearly, honestly, with the knowledge that the numbers told a story, and the story mattered. The ranch's story was a good one, building year over year with the patient arithmetic of people who were not in a hurry because they understood they were building something meant to last. Years later, Charlotte Cross would sometimes sit at the desk in the office, her desk the one that had been buried in disordered ledgers when she first sat down at it, and she would think about the woman she had been on the platform in Millbrook on a cold October evening, with 40 cents and a folded letter and the specific, complete absence of a future. She thought about how it had felt to whisper those words to no one, to the cold Montana wind and the empty station and the shape of a hope that had just dissolved. I have nowhere else to go. And she thought about what she had found in the place she'd had no choice but to stay. The work, the case, the man on the dark horse who said, "My empty house is yours," not with words but with coffee and questions about fences and a hand held under a table when the world needed holding together. She had not gone home. She had become one. And that the life she had not planned, the love she had not expected, the home she had built from the wreckage of a lie turned out to be more than she had ever known to ask for, and everything she had ever actually needed.